All right, guys, welcome back into another video. We're going to do a basic baseline setup for the UMP modifieds and then go over the adjustment guide. So we're getting started. So we decided to go to Jacobs County for this. And as you can see, I haven't done a setup for it yet. So we're going to go from dead nothing to my baseline, what my baseline setup is. If you watch the Dirt Late model setup for these, then you know kind of where I'm going with this. The only difference is I may run just a touch more camber in the front end of these cars than I do. We'll go 4.8, 4.9, that's where I'm at. And these are about the same. I go about a 280, 3.0, 3.0, 9, 220, 210, somewhere around in there. You can fine tune this stuff more as you go, but I just kind of get it in this range. Spring rate in the right front, we'll go with a 270, 3.0, 3.0, 9. Left rear, we'll go with I usually go 10 pounds heavier on the right rear than I do the left rear. I don't know why. I mean, I have no reason for that. That's just in my head. That's what I always do. Stagger 0, 40, 54. Now, see, this right here is where I get kind of wonky with it at. Like, I want to go to 55 on crossweight, and that's usually where I start at. But I want to play around with doing 51 to 52 because, like in the sprint cars and the micro minis and all that stuff, I generally start at 51% left. Even in the wingless sprints. So J-bar is at 15. We'll go 16, 15. Ride height's negative 2. Rear weight. We'll go 58.5. 30 soft, and then this. The gear ratio I'll play around with during when I practice. Now this is my baseline. This is where I start everything at when I go to a track. And now, again, when you get into some of the non-sanctioned tracks like Prairie View and different things like that, but I'll still start here. But it'll get way off from this when I end up, with what setup it is. But this is generally where I'll start at. And then, like I did last time, I'll go run a lap or two and see how it does. And then we'll be back in a minute. All right, guys, so as you can see, that setup for Jacobs County was pretty good. It went a 11.976. Goal time was a 12.090. So as we're going through this setup situation here, if you want to write the setup down, this is a good setup for Jacobs County for the UMP modifieds. I'll be doing a what do you call it? A setup video for this, I'm sure, but that just shows me that that's good at Jacobs County. Camber angle on the front end, and what you're trying to do with the camber angle on these cars is you're trying to camber angle, like if you got positive camber angle like you do in the left front. Well, what that is that's the tires, the top of the tire, positive camber is leaning towards the engine, right? So on the right front, negative camber is the top of the tire leading away from the engine. And what you're doing as you go in the corner, these tires do this, and you're wanting them to get stood straight up because your car's rolling over, so the right's going up and the left's dropping. So that's why you have positive camber in the left front and negative camber in the right front. So as you go in the corner, these two tires, as they're doing this, stand straight up. If that makes sense. And so that's why at a steeper bank track, then you have to have more camber in the right front, or negative camber in the right front because it's coming up further. Well, on a flat track, if it's coming up just a little bit, then if you have too much camber, then the wheels ain't getting straight up and down. So that's why on a flat blank track, you'll take less camber out of it. So when they go in the corner and it barely moves, then it gets straight up and down. So that's why I run more camber on a high bank track than I do a low bank track. And I say more camber, like more negative in the right front, more positive in the left front. Spring rate on the left front is dealing with Generally, the spring rates on the front will deal more with corner entry. I mean, the right front affects some from center out, but it'll affect more on corner entry. More left front spring rate will free a car up getting into the corner. And like I said in the late model one, if you put a pin in the left front and drive the car, it'll try to drive around that pin. So that just tells you it's going to be loose. On the shock bump, both the shock bumps kind of work the same. So if you go higher on either front shock bump, it'll make the car tighter on entry. If you go lower on the front shock bumps, it'll make the car freer on entry. Like 3.0 is the lowest you can go, so that's as low as it is. So I can only go up from here. So I can only make the car tighter on entry by raising my shock bump. So say if I run a 4.5 degree valving on the shock bump, well, and it's too tight getting in the corner, well, then I would just lower that shock bump in the front and it would free the car up, because the lower you get on the shock bump in the front, freer the car gets. The more you put in the shock bump on the front, the tighter the car gets. Now, the shock rebound on the left front will affect the car on exit, just like the shock bump affects it on entry. So if you go higher on the shock rebound on the left front, it'll make the car tighter on exit. If you drop the shock rebound on the left front down, it'll make it freer on exit. So kind of the shock bump affects entry, shock rebound affects exit on the left front. To whereas on the right front, the shock rebound, where the shock bumps are the same on the left front and the right front as far as affecting the car, a higher shock rebound on the right front will actually free the car up on exit. Instead of tightening it up, it'll free it up on exit. So the higher you get with the shock rebound on the right front, the freer it'll be on exit. The lower you come with the shock rebound on the right front, the tighter it'll be on exit. Tire pressures on these cars, again, I go with the 9, 9, 9, and then usually 11 in the right rear. And I use that pretty much universally across all the cars. But in the late model setup, I didn't really talk about much what the tire pressure does. So I figured in this video, I would tell you what the tire pressures do. So on the left front, if you go higher with the tire pressure, it'll make it looser getting in. If you go lower on the tire pressure on the left front, it'll make it tighter getting in, which is opposite of the right front. If you go higher on the tire pressure on the right front, it'll make it tighter getting in. If you lower it on the right front, if you go lower on the right front, it'll make it freer getting in. On the left rear, on the spring rate, the more spring rate you got in the left rear, the tighter the car will be on exit. As you're exiting the corner, it'll make the nose want to push towards the wall. The higher you get with the spring, the lower you go with the spring, the more free the car will be through the corner. The same with the front. Just on the rear of the shock bump, both of them will do the same thing. It'll make it tighter on exit if you raise the shock bump in the rear. If you lower either one of them, it'll make it looser on exit. So just know raising the shock bump in the rear will tighten the car up. Lowering it will make the car freer. And that works on both the left rear and the right rear. And just like the front, the shock rebound on the left rear, the shock rebound affects entry of the corner. So like the left rear, if you raise the shock bump on the left rear, or the shock rebound, the rebound, if you raise the shock rebound on the left rear, it'll make the car looser getting in the corner. If you lower the shock rebound on the left rear, it'll make the car tighter getting in the corner. Exactly the opposite of what it is on the right rear. If you raise the right rear shock rebound, it'll make the car tighter getting in the corner. If you lower it, it'll make it freer getting in the corner. Then the left rear, if you raise the tire pressure on the left rear, it'll make it tighter on exit. Lower the tire pressure on the left rear, it'll make it freer on exit. Spring rate on the right rear, if you raise the spring rate on the right rear, it'll make it looser through the center on exit, or as you're on the throttle, rolling through the throttle, it'll free the car up. The higher the spring rate on the right rear, the lower the spring rate, it'll make it more tight on the throttle and center the corner off. We've already been through shock bump, shock rebound, tire pressure on the right rear. And you think about tire pressure the same as the spring on that side. So if you raise the tire pressure on the right rear, it'll free the car up from the center off, and it'll free it up on the throttle. If you lower the tire pressure on the right rear, it'll make it tighter through the center and on the throttle. And then tire stagger is just the rear tires being different sizes, and it helps the car turn the corner. So that would mean like you'd put a cup with a small side and a big side, like a plastic cup. If you sit it on a table and roll it, that cup's going to roll in a circle. Same thing idea here. The tire stagger, your left rear is smaller than your right rear, and how much smaller your left rear is than your right rear determines how much stagger you have. And the more stagger you got, the more the car will turn. And the only time I've ever used that is at Bristol. Myself, I ain't saying that you can't use it and be fast with it, because all the setups that I do is geared towards the way I drive the car, and everybody drives it different, and that's why everybody won't agree with everything as far as my setups go. Everybody won't agree with it, but I feel like enough people will that it'll help some people out. Because there's got to be other people that drive like I do out there. Front brake bias. Again, the less you have front brake bias, the more the car will turn when you get on the brake. So like if you got 20% front brake bias, that means you got 80% going towards the rear, and when you get on the brakes, the car will turn. If you want to slow the car down or stop it more straight, like if you're getting into a corner, like say Elm Creek or something that's a long straightaway, and you got to kind of slow the car into the corner straight and then turn it, then no more rear weight. I get up to 60% rear weight, because that means you got 60% front brake and 40% rear brake, and so it'll stop the car more straight. If you use the brakes a lot, I don't really use it that much, so I've never really messed with that a whole lot. Left side weight, more or less, is the weight that's on both your left side tires combined, and what percentage that is. More left side weight will make the car feel loose, or right side weight will make the car feel tighter. Cross weight, that's the right front to the left rear tire. What you're working on there is the higher you get it, the more traction you'll have, the more forward traction, but the car will be tighter. It'll be tighter and more forward traction. The more you drop that down, the less forward traction you'll have, and it'll free the car up. Now, I've always been of the mind of having as much traction as I can get, and I can statically make the car looser other ways than the cross weight. But just know the higher you get, the more forward traction you get, and the tighter the car will feel. You could free the car up. And there are some tracks that you don't need really forward traction because you're running momentum, like say Eldora, where you run a lot of momentum. You get your momentum up and you're running around it. Or off the top of my head, I can't think of another track, but something like that where you're running a lot of momentum. You may not run as much cross weight in the car there because you don't need that forward traction. To where, like say you go to Elm Creek where you're running down the corner and turning it and driving off the corner, where you need cross weight in it to have that forward traction, if that makes sense. On the ride heights, the lower you get the ride height number, say that's down at 2 inches, it'll give the front end more grip the lower you go with the front ride height, but it also free the car up. It'll make it loose. So if you got a low front ride height, it'll free the car up. The higher you get with that number, like say if you go up to a 0 or up to a 1, it'll make the car feel tighter. It's been the exact opposite with me, and I'm just going to tell you, that's the way it's supposed to work. But to me, every time I drop the front ride height and the rear ride height down, the car feels closer to the ground, and it feels snug to the ground. But maybe because I always do them both together, I don't do one or the other. So maybe if I took my front ride height or my rear ride height and raised it up to 0 and left my front ride height at -2, I'd probably feel it a lot more. But the reason I don't, I think dropping my rear ride height down to -2 as well kind of offsets the front being low. On the chassis J-bar, if you increase the chassis J-bar height, like say you go from 16 to 20, that'll free it up on entry. If you go from 20 to 16, that'll make it tighter on entry, which is the exact opposite on the axle J-bar height. If you drop the axle J-bar height, it'll free it up on entry. If you raise the axle J-bar height, it will tighten it up. If you've got 20 inch on the frame and 10 inch on the rear end, then that's as loose as you're going to get entering the corner. Or if you go down to 15 and up to 15, that's as tight as you're going to make the car enter in the corner, if that makes sense. Now, one other thing, if you're not maxed out at 20 and 10, say that you're at 14 and 16, we'll say, okay? If you raise both J-bars up the same amount, you'll free the car up in the center. If you lower both J-bars down the same amount, you will tighten the car in the center. And the ride height in the rear is just the opposite. So if you've got a less ride height in the rear, it makes the car tighter. If you raise the ride height in the rear, it makes the car freer. So that kind of offsets what it does in the front, and that's why I was saying. But just so you know that if you lower it in like this, it'll tighten the car up. If you raise it from 2 to 1, it'll free the car up regardless of what you're doing with the front. So that's what the rear ride height does. And the rear weight is the same about as the late models. On a long sweeping turn like an Eldora or a Knoxville, Iowa, or different places, the rear weight, the more you raise it up, will help the car turn the corner. It'll help it on turn in a little bit, but it'll help it more through the center and off as far as turning the corner. You just have to watch and get a range of how much, but more or less, if you take the rear out of it, it'll make the car tight filling through the corner, where if you raise the rear weight up, it'll free the car up through the corner. Especially a long sweeping turn, it'll give you traction and help the car turn. Now, I like to run a lot of rear weight, like up to 60 and 61% at short, small tracks where you got to run in and stop and get the car turned and then drive off, because I feel like it helps the car rotate the center and off in the bottom. So I'll run a lot of rear percentages in those places. But generally, 58 and a half, and it just depends. You just have to kind of play with it until you find that happy medium. The wheel locks 30 degrees, and it's just like I could set it up to whatever, to where it's just how far your wheels turn before you're at lock, more or less. It's how quick your front tires turn. On a long track or different tracks, the car will want to kind of dart, pull. And if it does that, you can do the steering offset. And usually the only time I usually use steering offset is in sprint cars, micro minis, those types of cars. The midgets, I'll use steering offset to where the car wants to pull to the inside, and I'll use that to offset it. Tire compound is soft. Like I said, in the late model one, I don't really use anything but soft right now. If I got into a long race where I was running quite a bit more laps, I would probably get into a medium or a firm. Somebody told me through comments the other day that, like, there's tracks that if you're too tight at a track, you can kind of go up on your tire to a medium or a firm, and it'll free the car up. I haven't tried it yet, but that's something you could play with. And then the rear end gear ratio, generally on this, and like I said with the late models, I will usually start either right at, and if it feels like it's too much, I'll drop it down 10 or 20 points on my gearing ratio, and that usually puts me right on. But this one was perfect for Jacobs County for the UMP Modifieds. All right, guys, I hope this has helped. I got more setup videos and baseline videos coming up. We'll see you in the next video.